Hi, my name is Aviva Fink, and I'm today's host for Altus Group's CRE Exchange Podcast. And today's episode, we're focusing in on the impact of housing affordability on commercial real estate. And I'm very fortunate to be joined by two industry experts, Peter Norman and Omar Eltorai. Before getting started, just here's a brief synopsis of what we'll be covering today. So housing affordability is a widespread issue in many parts of the world, particularly in areas with high demand and limited supply of housing. The impact of housing affordability extends beyond residential real estate and can negatively impact commercial real estate, as well as future commercial and residential development. When housing becomes less affordable, it can change employment patterns, limit economic growth, and affect the demand for rental properties, including commercial properties. As we open up today's conversation, we're going to get perspectives from both our Canadian and US experts on housing affordability, the effect on commercial real estate, and their predictions for how things are going to play out in the short to medium term. And with that, Peter, welcome to today's podcast. Do you mind giving our audience a brief overview of your background?
So my name is Peter Norman, and I'm responsible for our national economic advisory practice, principally in Canada. And I have been part of Altus Group now. It's my 25th year, so certainly quite a long time.
Happy anniversary.
Always in this role of the in the context of the economics practice. I have an economics degrees and have been working in this industry for about 30 years. And I'm going to be speaking, I guess, mostly about the Canadian context and what we kind of see beyond. But I think it's all going to kind of feather into the overall discussion. So really looking forward to it. Thanks, Aviva.
Excellent. And Omar, passing it over to you. Welcome to the podcast. Do you mind giving our audience a little bit of information about your background?
Certainly. Thank you for having me here today. Also looking forward to the conversation. I'm a director of research here at Altus Group. And really my background's been in investment management. So I'm coming at this from and covering really the macro capital and market trends that affect commercial real estate predominantly in the U.S.
All right, fantastic. So maybe just to kick things off, Peter, starting with you, where are we currently in an emerging post-pandemic landscape when it comes to housing affordability?
So housing affordability, of course, is pretty broad topic and can mean different things to different segments depending on how you look at it, but it can also be measured in different ways depending on what kinds of policies or segments you're sort of looking at. So in very broad strokes, we think about affordability being, first of all, related to the ability to access housing by the consumer. It's more of a consumer side concept. So you can measure that in the case of ownership housing by looking at flow metrics like what your housing payments would be on a mortgage on a typical house relative to your income. So that would be a reasonable way of measuring whether it's affordable or not. In the case of rental, of course, it could be done the same way with your rents. But often data limitations also back us into other ways of sort of measuring it. So we often see affordability measures being something like the price of a house. Relative to somebody's full income, that would be called the multiple, for example. And those data are easier to put together and are in many cases more comparable from one jurisdiction to another. So you see it, but of course that's kind of a bit of a flow and a stock being compared to each other. So it's not quite as comparable. But affordability in general has to do with the access to housing, the cost of access to housing. I'll just say as a kind of a final piece is, we tend to kind of measure these things relative to income, and that, of course, is important. And income is something that can be sort of easily measured. But realistically, what we want to think about when we're thinking about affordability is where does housing sit in the pantheon of needs and goods that a household needs to spend on. So everybody needs to spend on their shelter. They also need to spend on food. They also need to spend on some other categories of goods and services. And the more expensive that homes are, the more expensive that rents become. Of course, that crowds out or pushes out your ability to spend on some of those other things. So how important is housing relative to those other things is often what we're talking about in this context.
Mm-hmm. Very helpful. And Omar, over to you, just in terms of kind of what we've seen over the last 3 years. So there was a lot of talk during, I guess, the COVID era, and I'm going to use that in with air quotes and say that maybe we're beyond that now, where there was the flight to the suburbs and everyone was moving out. That changed some of the affordability factors for housing from an ownership standpoint. And now we're dealing with other factors that may be driving up the cost of housing, whether it's rental or owned. What are some of those factors, and what are people facing when it comes to access to housing?
Absolutely. So I think from right now is a pretty unique time in the sense that we are getting hit with a number of the trends that have started during the COVID time that you mentioned. And those being, you have inflation being a big one. So, and this is factoring into, you see this actually in rents, but it costs more to operate a building. And if you look at from a rental building and multifamily is one of the more expensive buildings to run in terms of, the building owner has a lot of expenses that are related to not only utilities, the marketing, the personnel. There are a lot of costs there. So it's a thinner margin business, and so when there is inflation, their expenses do go up, and they need to offset those. But also, I would say, another big impact that has constrained affordability has been the fact that we're moving from kind of free or incredibly cheap money to money costs something again. And when money was free and people could move and people really work anywhere they wanted, that's where you did see huge surges from whether it's from the coasts to the south or coasts in, but this flight to the suburbs that brought a lot of, a lot of incomes willing to spend on a limited supply that really drove pricing up. And now that not everything's reversing, but you can't borrow as much for as cheap, meaning that the individuals that may have been looking, if they were just getting ready to buy, they actually may be stuck renting for longer because they don't either have the down payment, they can't find something that kind of fits their budget. But if they were at that point, if renting makes more sense, that contributes to in supporting rents continuing to go higher. So that was a long answer there, but hopefully that.
No, I think that's a helpful framing. So really, when it comes to just affordability and what options the consumer has on where they find dwelling, right, and whether it's a kind of rent versus buy, it comes down to supply and demand, right, and just like what's available, and that's going to affect pricing. And so that also probably impacts, and Peter, I'll let you clarify this, the impact on commercial real estate as an asset class, right? Because they're still looking at supply and demand. And it's less about, where they're going to live, but it's where people are going to live. And that informs the net operating income or the revenues that the profits they're able to get from managing that asset. So what are we seeing in terms of supply and demand, and does it differ by geography or by market?
So I think that you're gonna, in the end, when you're thinking about all of your asset classes and you're thinking about a community and you're thinking about building out the sort of development, there's always going to be a kind of a need and a desire to build out developments in mixed use kind of way, and where you're having housing and you're having other types of any communities have all of those types of things. But where we have housing affordability issues, it can really affect that kind of choice of mix and how you're developing out your communities, how assets are going to perform across different types of asset classes. So in a market where housing affordability is starting to get more and more constrained, and let's say that it's an isolated market, let's say it's not necessarily a global phenomena equally, but some markets, and we do have that right now. I mean, we have markets in the U.S. that have a particularly constrained affordability right now, like San Francisco and New York, et cetera. And we have Toronto and Vancouver in Canada that has really strained affordability, and then lesser so in other markets. And so if you have some markets where housing affordability is quite constrained, then what kind of an impact is that going to have on your ability to build out and maintain other types of assets? One thing is you have that kind of budgetary impact that I just sort of talked about. The longer you go where households are spending more and more and more on housing, all of a sudden you have a shift away from, for instance, retail sales. Mm-hmm. You have and that's going to kind of shift. That's going to shift your need for retail and a bunch of other implications and the performance of retail assets and a bunch of other performance as well. So if you own a bunch of retail assets in a market, you probably want that market to have relatively good housing affordability as well. So that it's a well-functioning community, so people are spending at local malls and shopping centers and so on and so forth, and that it's all working, not that it's not constrained. And then, from both retail and also from an office perspective, economic development is a pretty important impact. Office sectors do well when you have strong economic development in an area. And I would put forward that economic development and housing affordability are very strongly linked, because you have a market where affordability becomes too constrained. That's one where where you're simply not going to have the inflow of the labor force that you need to build jobs and fill offices and create that kind of demand. So your kind of supply and demand mix between housing and office and other things, kind of sometimes comes down as well to those kinds of outcomes from the affordability process. In a market right now, we have markets right now, major markets where the obvious solution to really constrained housing affordability would be, for instance, building more housing. I mean, that's a pretty obvious outcome.
If only were that easy.
And if only it were that easy, that's true. But that would be the kind of outcome that you're doing. But in many cases, building that new housing and building it quickly can mean being more flexible with some of your other assets, right? So the office market is soft right now in many North American markets post-COVID, because we've got a kind of a transcendental shift going on in terms of office demand. And we also have, lots and lots of B and C class buildings that are ready to be converted and or redeveloped into housing projects. And yet we still have a lot of jurisdictions. And in Canada, we've got laws against conversion, laws against redeveloping office properties, as an example, which stand in the way of this kind of thing. So you've got this obvious opportunity to shift some assets into others, and to positively affect the affordability issue through supply and demand. But there are policy constraints sometimes getting in the way of that sort of thing. So that, anyway, a variety of impacts back and forth.
Yeah, it's really amazing, because you think about, or when I think about a specific asset class, I kind of put my blinders on. I'm like, oh, but how is this asset class performing? What's the supply and demand here? How is it being priced? What are the impacts? What is impacting the pricing? But then to your point, well, the ramifications, there's only a limited amount of spend out there. So if you're spending on housing, then you're reducing your retail expenditures. And so what implication does that have on retail? And so on and so forth. But Omar, coming back to you, something interesting you said toward the opening is that multifamily is one of the more expensive asset classes to maintain and manage. So thinking about that plus inflation, and the need that, especially in markets where there's high demand and low supply, right? So we have this affordability problem. So we need more housing. What happens then? Multifamily is expensive. cost of capital is expensive. So where does that leave the industry?
Yeah, I think we're going to find out. So if you're looking at it from a development standpoint, I think that it can become a pretty clear kind of it's almost, it's math, right? Looking at what are your financing options, as well as inflation has really kind of rocked construction in the sense that materials and labor have even though they've come down from some of the inflation rates that you were seeing maybe 6 to 8 months ago. It's a bit tamer, but there's like these prices are still up. They're never in a deflation, right? They're never getting cheaper. It's just the long-term trend is they're more expensive, but just at different paces. So I think if you're looking at whether you're building and bringing a new project online, that can be easy to judge, or easier to judge, because it's you either get the green light or you never get it started. Because right now I think we're very much in an environment where the costs, whether that's of building, of capital, but all those costs actually really do constrain whether or not something can get off the ground. Development also, you do have the hurdle of I'll call it the political hurdle, in the sense that getting the right permits, that it takes time. There's a real time cost to that, and so I think that is definitely if you're looking at a development project, and I would say those are a lot of the headwinds, and they add to a lot of uncertainty there. But in terms of if it's an existing building, I do think that is one of the reasons why, if it's an existing building, you have tenants and it's fully operational. I think that's one of the reasons why you see the rents are really actually like a delayed inflation factor, right? Because they do keep going up, and they reset only, in the US, it's usually 1, if not 2 years. And so it takes a while. It does take some time for these to reset, but you are still seeing positive inflation. Now, you are also starting to see way more concessions getting involved, so that the actual net effective rent growth seen across markets is coming down. But that's another lever that the ultimately property owners pull as trying to make sure that their top rent growth stays strong, and they're still able to effectively attract tenants. Something does have to give, right? Either it persists in this. If it's an ongoing inflationary environment, you do have you should see those rents continue to price up. But another one of the big pieces of that is the overall margin of multifamily is relatively thin when you're looking at kind of other property types, and how because you can't pass as much of those expenses onto or really elsewhere onto the occupants, when overall prices, and I'm speaking about prices because it's all just broadly inflation trends in one direction, the property type will often kind of keep adjusting. Maybe I'm overly cautious, but there is a concern that if you can't keep your rent growth, your expenses are largely still sticky in whether it's deflationary or just if you recently had your expenses priced up, but you can't get positive rent growth, that's when you start to see your margins really collapse pretty dramatically.
I mean, so those are a lot of right. I think things that you've enumerated that indicate, the challenges that commercial real estate faces when it thinks about just performance for multifamily, and some of the things that are the headwinds that may get in the way of easing some of the affordability pains being felt in various markets. And Peter, what do you see that's being done to help ease some of that affordability pain? Are there regulatory things in place? Are there, I guess, organizational or maybe even just some really creative investor decisions that are being made to work around some of these challenges?
I think when you look at sort of government or organizational policy around affordability, housing affordability, it really runs the gamut. It goes right from the good, the bad, to the ugly, I suppose, that you see out there. And I guess we would like to sort of see a lot more of the good and a lot less of some of that other stuff. When I think about that gamut, right at the top of the list. Well, sorry, let me just take a step back and say, first of all, I think that it's important for any policy to kind of differentiate what we mean by affordability between the idea about general market affordability. And most of this podcast, we've been talking about this idea that for a typical, family, middle class, upper class, whatever family, they should that wants to locate in the market, they should be able to find housing that's appropriate to their income, or that's a general affordability. There's also the side of the equation of deeply affordable units for families who are in need of deeply affordable, and that you have sufficient amount of deeply affordable units as well in your market in order to ensure, from a social policy standpoint, that there's shelters provided. And so I think policies need to be cognizant of both sides of those coins at the same time and address it. We like income support schemes for families that are in need, because that, you can design them in different ways, but ways that provide shelter allowances to families that are in need, that then allow them to participate in the open market and to be part of the supply and demand of housing on an equal footing. And those are pretty good policies. In terms of actual supply of additional housing, governments, should be directly involved in the provision of deeply affordable units, but should be doing so not at the expense of other housing or others. Shouldn't be at the exclusion of other housing, but they should be involved in bringing those kinds of policies forward. And I think a role that governments can play in terms of housing affordability across the spectrum, and this can even affect deeply affordable as well, is just planning for communities in a comprehensive way that provides an adequate range and mix of housing for the expectations that you have. Now that seems like it's simple. That seems like, I'm just saying.
That actually seems really complicated, because
it seems like
thinking about all the moving pieces.
But it's not that way. I mean, for the last number of decades, planning jurisdictions, many in the US and many in Canada, major jurisdictions, have had other objectives in terms of the range and mix of housing that's being provided. Some of those objectives are, for example, encouraging densification because it has environmental benefits or others, to it. And yet we have a population that looks for, a certain amount of population that looks for non-dense housing. And if you've got policies that have the wrong mix of housing between, say, apartment projects and single family for what the market is looking for, that's going to cause market imbalance, and market imbalance is going to lead to affordability issues. So we like to see planning policies that are a lot more tied to what the future needs of the community actually are. Those would be really good, and they would address affordability. When I talk about the gamut from good to bad to ugly, that the things that are ineffective are things like in Canada right now, we're gripped by foreign buyer bans, the notion came into the public policy discussion a number of years ago that somehow it was foreign direct investment coming from other countries that was leading to a affordability issue, rather than the fact that a lot of this investment is actually creating supply, which it is. And a lot of those bans have gone in place, and they are largely one of the issues that has actually exacerbated the affordability issues now because of the way that it's choked it up. And then I'll leave the worst to the last, because it's something that's prevalent in a lot of U.S. markets, is just coming into Canadian markets and is also really messing things up. And that's inclusionary zoning type policies. And now inclusionary zoning type policies, as a small primer, is it's like providing subsidized housing, because it's a mandate to put a certain amount of deeply affordable units in kind of any larger development project that's coming forward. But those subsidies are coming from the other units in the project, not from government. So you're putting up the price of market housing in order to subsidize a certain number of deeply affordable units. And predictably, what happens with that, for anybody who kind of understands economics so well, is that a lot of those projects just don't simply work. Or if they do work, they push up the price of market housing, and that exacerbates the problem. So I would like to see a lot more good planning. I would like to see, where possible, subsidies going directly to those in need, and then adequate supply of the right range and mix of housing. And I think that we're going to tackle a lot of these problems.
And so, Omar, coming to you, how would you think about tackling these problems? I think Peter outlined, a great vision for one way to, or I guess several ways to go about helping to solve some of the affordability crisis. Are there certain things that you think about, because I'm sure you do, you dream about affordable housing at night, and you're like, oh, if these things are things we could address as a society, we would be able to alleviate some of the pain.
Yeah, no, Peter's the economist here. He speaks the truth. And I agree with everything he says there. I would add that I don't know if it's bad or ugly, but in the U.S. there's been a flurry of I would say rent control measures that have gone through, and I would say that's another one that is certainly nuanced in terms of good intentions, but not always great outcomes. But also in the U.S., I would say that there have been a rather successful program has been. Well, first of all, in the U.S., you have the agencies that are very active, and recently they've had their scorecard updated. It must have been November or December, and what happened is their regulator essentially tells them, this is what we want you to, this is the amount of money that we want you to put out towards these missions. And they effectively broaden the scope, which this is actually a good thing.
This is going back to what Peter was talking about, right? We've got broader affordability, yes, but then we have affordability for lower income families.
Yes. And this is there's at least the, I don't want to say the slang, but the jargon, right? In the US is capital A versus lowercase a, right? So capital A means it's some sort of government, program. It's going to be, it's going to qualify for, X, say 30% or 50% of the units within this property are essentially priced to a certain kind of, the HUD will put out numbers,
yeah,
based on AMI and so there's a lot that a lot of numbers, a lot of thought that goes into this. But if it qualifies for that, and it qualifies for the agency financing, that can be capital A. Other programs that are very helpful in the U.S. is really LIHTC. So it's LIHTC and Section 8. So LIHTC being an acronym for Low Income Housing Tax Credit, and as the tax credit, right? That could suggest that really is it's giving it's lighter taxes to support the investment in this low income housing. All of this is to say, I think that the success of these programs and these structures, at least in the U.S., should point to the right direction. Of it very much can be and greater affordability can be achieved through I'd say these financial incentives. One area though that is a little bit that I do think could and to really address your question directly is more there needs to be more development financing. The issue really is supply, as Peter pointed out. And while there are some programs that do support development, it really requires the project sponsors to jump through a lot of hoops, and it can effectively extend timelines, and it puts a lot of they could be easier, right? Like so, and therefore the developments could or overall affordable supply could hit the market faster.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to ask either of you to look in at your crystal ball and kind of predict, the medium or long term outcomes of the affordable housing and where we'll be in 6, 12, 18 months time, maybe 5 years time. I won't do that, just given kind of how volatile things have been, the last couple of months. But I would love to get each of your perspectives on resources or just areas of exploration that you would encourage our audience to go and pursue, given that this is kind of, I would say, actually rapidly changing in that it's reacting to the market, to changing market dynamics. So where can they go for resources? What sort of data should they be looking at? What are ways for our audience to be as informed as possible and help them understand opportunities and risk as they think about multifamily and affordability? Peter, maybe starting with you.
I guess the answer to that question could be as varied as what people's needs are when they're going into this sort of thing. I mean, Omar has talked a lot about the access to financing and other types of issues, and there's, of course, will be a lot of resources around how to navigate that important channel. I think if you're just trying to kind of keep tabs on the direction of movement, where things are going, what's going on. I mean, there are resources on both sides of the border. I mean, the Royal Bank puts out an affordability index and monitors this on a quarterly basis. A lot of people watch that. The CMHC and on our side of the border, HUD on the south side of the border, both have affordability indexes that people monitor. But I just kind of caution with a lot of that information that a lot of them are better at kind of pinpointing the movement of direction, like are things getting kind of worse or better from the last time period? And I think that they're probably good in that. They tend to kind of get out of whack over time in terms of a kind of a cross section or whatever, like comparing one affordable spot to another. But anyway, nonetheless, there's lots of data that's available, and I'd say just keep watching Altus. I mean, we're also in the business of trying to monitor policy, trying to advise governments and the private sector about how best to navigate this space and how best to use the data and tools and services that we can provide in order to maximize your ability to get housing built, if that's what you're trying to do, to get approvals put in place and other things. So always happy to be part of that conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And I'm actually very glad that you brought up Altus, because I think to your point, one of the challenges is there's a lot of data out there, but how do you synthesize that data, interpret the data, and action the data? And so just specifically in terms of, north of the border, I believe that the state of the market, the quarterly state of the market webinar, in which you are one of the regular stars, is a great place for our audience to go for additional insights and just kind of timely perspectives on what's happening, what's unfolding, and kind of what to be prepared for next. And Omar, maybe before commenting on other resources that Altus has in its arsenal for our audience, I would love to get your perspective on materials that would be a good fit for our audience.
Yeah, so I would say, yeah, outside of Altus, I would probably similar to, as Peter pointed out, the public resources, I would tack on, at least in the U.S., the census. A lot of this permitting data is great there, so you can see the pipeline. But then I'm always a huge fan of following public markets and the participants in the public markets. I think the easiest to, at least when it comes to just broad, now I'm talking like lowercase affordability, is following a number of the larger REITs and their commentary there. That should give direction around overall rents. I think it's important to, I'm a huge fan of anecdotal evidence because I think anecdotes are single points that then feed or roll up into like larger numbers.
I wonder if the economist on today's conversation is like, just kind of seizing over
Cringe
that.
a little bit when
I
Omar
hear your
said
point.
Well, I think I live in New York, and so a lot of friends. I know a lot of renters, right? And when I hear that they're getting concessions after we're coming off of double-digit rent, like year-on-year rent growth, that's a pretty big. I've heard it first from friends that were moving before I saw data and like kind of like media and outlets pick up on it. But I think that. The good thing is multifamily and just residential as a whole is by far the largest real estate or like built space, and it's the one that matters the most for most politicians' constituents. Therefore, it does get a lot of attention. So I don't mean to say this backhandedly, but to find out more, just like open your eyes, right? Pay attention to what's going on.
That's right. I think that's, a good point where it's, yes, data is important and analysis is important, but just looking at number of listings in a market, seeing how it compares to the Zestimate or where like prices are being cut or concessions are being made on rental properties, all of that does give signal to like where the market is headed and how supply and demand are playing with each other to drive prices up, down, or in all kinds of weird directions. At this point, in the 21st century, I don't guess like which direction we're going. We're going in all directions concurrently. And with that, unfortunately, I think that is all the time we have for today. So just one last plug. I do know we mentioned the state of the market up in Canada. We do have a state of the market in the US as well. You can find out more information on the Altus Group website. And we do also have regular insights from our industry experts available on our website as well. And you can always tune in here at our podcast to learn more. We look forward to bringing Peter and Omar back for future conversations. Thank you so much for your time today. And there will be links to all the resources mentioned in today's notes. Thanks again for listening, and keep an eye out for the next episode. Have a great one.